Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're not just looking at a source. We're really grappling with a document that pulls absolutely no punches about the American legal system.
That's right.
We are diving into a paper by scientific analyst Justin Lake, and the title itself tells you a lot. Jury trials are a joke.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging piece. Lake isn't, offering gentle tweaks or minor reforms here.
Not at all.
He's launching this full-scale structural assault on how we actually do justice in the U.S.
Yeah.
And we should probably say up front, his language, his rhetoric, it's aggressive, very direct.
It absolutely is. The tone is unmistakable, but behind that aggression, there's a critique that honestly forces you to look at some really uncomfortable evidence-backed arguments.
Mm-hmm.
So the mission for this deep dive is to unpack Lake's main argument, which is really profound. He says we are completely misunderstanding what exonerations actually mean. The usual story, the media narrative, it frames them as, oh, look, the system worked eventually. Justice corrected itself.
Right, the happy ending narrative. But Lake flips that entirely. And this is the core thesis, the thing that really grabs you from the start. His view, very starkly put, is that every single exoneration, it's not justice corrected.
Sure, what is it then?
He just calls it a receipt that the system failed. Plain and simple. It's proof positive, he says, that justice didn't exist in the first place for that person in that trial.
Wow. That reframing, it really hits hard. And if his data holds up, it feels, well, necessary, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It shifts the whole conversation away from, celebrating the rescue of the innocent person.
Which is important, of course, but...
Of course, but it puts the spotlight, the condemnation, squarely on the state's machinery. The shipwreck itself, not just the survivor floating on a raft. Lake has zero interest in treating these as isolated mistakes or, administrative hiccups.
None at all. He sees them as data points in a pattern, hard evidence of something fundamentally broken.
And Lake is insistent, isn't he, that we don't minimize this, that we don't just shrug and say, well, systems aren't perfect.
Exactly. That's a key theme running through his work. While the language is fiery and he gets very emotional talking about the victims the system creates, our job here is to really focus on the structural arguments he's making, the data points he uses to back it all up. He demands we confront the systemic nature of these failures, not explain them away.
Okay, so to really get Lake's argument about this being structural failure, we need to start where he starts. The cornerstone standard of the whole system.
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly. He basically aims to tear that down, calling it little more than a slogan, which is, a fundamental challenge right there.
It really is, because if you look at it through his lens, just using the sheer numbers, the logic of that standard being effective, well, it just doesn't add up.
How so?
Lake's central challenge is based on volume. He asks, okay, if beyond a reasonable doubt was a real functioning safeguard, like a truly solid wall protecting innocent people, how often would wrongful convictions happen?
You'd expect maybe a handful.
Yes.
Extremely rare cases.
Precisely. He says maybe once or twice. Freak occurrences. Statistical outliers that would actually prove the rule worked most of the time.
But that's not what we see in the data, is it?
Not even close. As he points out, these documented errors, these proven wrongful convictions, have been repeated thousands of times nationwide. Thousands. And the number keeps climbing. As more cases get reviewed, more DNA gets tested.
And that scale, for Lake, changes everything. It's not about individual errors anymore.
No, that sheer volume transforms it into what he calls a silent confession by the system itself. It's proof, in his view, that those supposed guardrails, especially beyond a reasonable doubt, just aren't working in practice. They're being bypassed constantly.
It's a powerful way to frame it, treating the total count of exonerations, cases where innocence is later formally established as cold, hard data proving system failure.
And he digs into how these exonerations happen. He lists the common causes. DNA evidence proving innocence years later. Prosecutors illegally hiding evidence that would have helped the defendant. Classic Brody violations.
Right, or witnesses lying under oath. Perjury.
Perjury. Police misconduct, like fabricating evidence or coercing confessions, faulty forensic science that was presented as certain. The list goes on.
And in every single one of those scenarios, Lake's point is that the evidence needed to create reasonable doubt was actually there during the original trial.
Yes, often glaringly obvious in hindsight, he argues. But it was either deliberately hidden or maybe just ignored or fundamentally misinterpreted by the jury or the judge at the time.
Which loops back to his claim that the standard isn't functioning. The fact that these doubts existed, maybe even strong doubts, and yet a conviction happened anyway.
I mean, the jury convicted despite the standard being, as he puts it, right in front of them. For Lake, this isn't just, people making honest mistakes under pressure. He sees it as evidence of a deep, systemic, structural issue that allows or even encourages that standard to be overridden when other pressures kick in, like the pressure to get a conviction.
And that leads us right into maybe the most provocative part of his analysis, this idea of intentional design.
Yeah, this is where it gets really uncomfortable.
He flat out states that wrongful convictions aren't just unfortunate accidents. They are, in his words, manufactured by design, not by accident. He thinks the system itself is built in a way that produces these outcomes.
It's a heavy charge.
Mhm.
He argues the whole set of the incentives, the procedures, prioritizes things like finality, institutional reputation, conviction rates over discovering the actual truth.
So the machine is designed to keep running smoothly and look effective, even if that means chewing up innocent people along the way.
That's the core of his argument there. He uses really strong language, saying the system produces more harm than it prevents. It takes innocent people and turns them into victims you created. He's not describing a system that's trying its best but occasionally failing. He's describing a system structured in a way that makes failure inevitable, even predictable.
So Lake completely rejects the notion that these are just minor glitches, right? The acceptable cost of doing business for a complex system.
Absolutely rejects it. And he emphasizes, again, that we cannot minimize the impact. These aren't statistical rounding errors. Each one represents a destroyed life, decades lost. He calls exonerations an indictment of the jury system itself, proof of fragility, maybe even fraudulence, baked into the core of the process.
That idea of fraudulence is strong. And it's worsened, he says, by the fact that the system then compounds the error. It doesn't just convict wrongly.
No. It then proceeds to put that innocent person in a cage and called it justice. That framing really underscores the moral dimension for him. And it sets up the rest of his paper, where he details how these failures happen step by step. He's making it clear this is an abstract legal theory. It's about real harm, real consequences that demand a real accounting. And that refusal to minimize, to downplay the destruction, it just fuels his entire critique.
It really does. It's a demand for answers, not just procedural adjustments. Okay, so let's dive deeper into exactly how he says those supposed safeguards fail in the actual courtroom. All right, so we've established Lake's view. Beyond a reasonable doubt is treated, in his words, like a magic spell that guarantees fairness. But spells aren't real. So how does the actual mechanism of a jury trial effectively, neutralize this legal requirement?
Lake really digs into the practical failure here. He argues the standard itself is just too vague, too ambiguous for 12 ordinary people, lay people, to apply consistently or objectively. I mean, think about it. How do you quantify reasonable doubt?
Right. Is it like a 5% chance the person is innocent, 10%, 25%? The law doesn't give you a number.
Exactly. Legal definitions tend to be circular, a doubt based on reason, things like that. It leaves the interpretation almost entirely subjective for each juror. And that ambiguity, Lake says, that's the first crack in the foundation, the first point of systemic failure.
That subjectivity is key, isn't it? Because Lake claims the reason jurors fail isn't necessarily bad faith, but that they simply don't weigh evidence, like scientists. They aren't trained in logic or statistics or critical evidence assessment.
No, they're human. They respond to emotion. They respond to how confidently a lawyer presents their case, how sincere a witness seems, which might have nothing to do with truthfulness. And they respond to their own inherent biases, often unconsciously.
So the conviction happens despite reasonable doubt being, as Lake puts it, right in front of them, because the whole trial environment overrides it.
Precisely. He sees the trial as this highly charged adversarial performance. And that performance, the drama of it, the narrative presented by the lawyers, consistently trumps the often complex, messy, ambiguous reality of the actual evidence, especially if that evidence requires careful, logical sifting.
Which basically means the standard becomes functionally useless in practice. If the legal phrase relies entirely on a juror's gut feeling or their emotional reaction to the lawyer's presentations.
Often presentations are by very skilled, well-resourced state prosecutors.
Right. Then it's not an objective threshold anymore. It's just a feeling, a vibe, which is terrifying when someone's liberty is at stake.
And this leads directly into Lake's second major critique in this section, the adversarial system itself. He argues it inherently rewards winning, not truth-finding.
He calls the courtroom a game of performance, not a laboratory seeking facts.
Exactly. The structure, the goal, is victory for one side or the other. And that goal, Lake contends, is fundamentally opposed to the goal of accuracy or objective truth.
Let's unpack those incentives because they seem crucial to his argument. Starting with the prosecution. We know, anecdotally perhaps, that prosecutors often build careers on conviction rates. How does Lake argue this shapes their behavior?
His analysis here is absolutely unforgiving. High conviction rates are the currency of success for prosecutors. They lead to promotions, public recognition, maybe political careers down the line. It's the metric they're judged on, internally and often publicly.
So the pressure is immense.
Immense. And Lake argues this pressure incentivizes prosecutors to push forward with cases even when significant doubts exist. Why risk tanking your conviction rate? Worse, he points to the examples from exoneration cases, where prosecutors actively suppressed evidence that could have helped the defense, Brady material, precisely because it would weaken their case and risk a loss.
And the consequences for doing that, for misconduct.
Often, they're delayed, minimal, maybe an internal reprimand years later, if anything. The penalty for losing the case now feels much more immediate and career damaging than the potential distant penalty for misconduct discovered later.
So the system itself creates a rational incentive from the prosecutor's perspective to prioritize the win over disclosing potentially exculpatory evidence.
That's exactly Lake's point. It's the definition of a structural flaw. The system rewards the very behavior securing convictions at almost any cost that leads directly to wrongful convictions. He suggests that if the system truly valued truth, the penalties for hiding evidence, for Brady violations, would be swift, severe, maybe career-ending. That would change the calculation entirely.
Make the risk far outweigh the reward.
Right. But as it stands, the incentives favor the conviction rate.
And what about the other side? The defense. They're playing the same game, but Lake argues they're structurally disadvantaged.
Hugely disadvantaged, especially public defenders who handle the vast majority of cases. He describes them as drowning under large caseloads and limited budgets.
So it's an uneven playing field from the start.
Inherently uneven. The defense often has very little time per case, barely enough money for basic investigation, let alone hiring expensive expert witnesses. And expert witnesses are crucial, right? They're the ones who can challenge the state's scientific evidence or explain complex psychological factors to the jury, introduce that reasonable doubt.
But they're up against the full resources of the state.
The police department, the state crime lab, the entire prosecutor's office with its investigators and staff. Lake stresses this massive resource disparity makes it incredibly hard for the defense to effectively compete in this performance game, to effectively counter the state's narrative and plant the necessary seeds of doubt required by law.
So pulling it together, Lake's synthesis is that the whole adversarial setup structurally rewards inaccuracy. It's built for wins, not for truth.
That's the bottom line for him. The system isn't designed to find out what really happened. It's designed to produce a winner and a loser, a conviction or an acquittal. And when that structural design leads to a wrongful conviction, Lake is absolutely adamant, do not minimize this outcome.
Don't just call it an error.
No. He sees that minimization, calling it an unfortunate mistake, or blaming an individual juror or lawyer as the system protecting itself. It avoids confronting the core charge, that the system itself is inherently structurally flawed. His paper really pushes us to see how the state is financially and professionally motivated to get convictions, sometimes tragically, at the expense of actual justice.
Okay, let's shift to the really practical in-the-room failures, Lake points out. This idea that we rely on, well, ordinary people, lay people, to interpret incredibly complex evidence to decide someone's fate.
Yeah, this is a really sharp part of his critique, focusing on the practical reality of a modern trial. Think about what we ask jurors to do.
Become instant experts, basically.
Exactly. Instant experts in fields that people dedicate their entire lives to, studying DNA analysis, ballistics, psychology, memory science. And they're supposed to master this based on maybe a few hours of testimony presented by lawyers who are deliberately shaping the information to support their side.
It sounds impossible when you put it like that. What specific areas does Lake highlight where jurors typically struggle?
He hits on several key areas. First, forensics and the illusion of scientific certainty. Lake argues that a lot of what gets presented as hard science in court is actually much softer, more subjective, or sometimes, frankly, just flawed.
Like bite mark analysis, maybe, or older hair comparison techniques.
Those are classic examples he likely draws on. Things presented with absolute certainty that later turned out to be unreliable, even junk science. But jurors, they see someone in a lab coat, they hear scientific-sounding terms, and they often treat that testimony as infallible gospel. They fail to grasp the inherent uncertainty or limitations, the reasonable doubt that a real expert might see.
Okay, what else?
Second, a big one, coercive interrogation tactics and the puzzle of false confessions. Jurors often bring this common-sense belief into the room. I would never confess to something I didn't do.
It seems logical, right? Why would you?
It seems logical, but Lake points out it's often wrong. Jurors rarely understand the intense psychological pressure of modern interrogation techniques, sleep deprivation, manipulation, threats, lies about evidence. He argues these tactics can absolutely leave vulnerable people, maybe someone young or with low intelligence or mental health issues, or just utterly exhausted and desperate to falsely confess just to make the interrogation stop. Jurors don't get that.
They see the confession and think, case closed.
Pretty much. And third, he talks about the fragility of human memory, especially eyewitness testimony. This is often seen as really powerful evidence I saw him do it.
But memory research shows it's incredibly unreliable, doesn't it?
Highly fallible. Lake argues jurors just don't understand how memory actually works. It's not like a video recording. It's reconstructive, suggestible. Post-event information can warp what someone thinks they saw. Police procedures, even unintentionally, can easily steer an identification. Jurors give eyewitness accounts way too much weight, ignoring the huge potential for error, for reasonable doubt.
So because jurors lack this specialized knowledge in science, psychology, memory, Lake says the system defaults to something much simpler and much more dangerous.
That's his argument. Since they can't truly evaluate the complex evidence on its merits, they're told to judge credibility. Who seems believable?
And what does that mean in practice, according to Lake?
He's quite dismissive here. He says it usually just boils down to judging superficial things. Who looks more respectable, who speaks more confidently, who prevents better, maybe even subconscious biases about appearance or demeanor. The trial stops being about analyzing facts and becomes, in his cutting phrase, theater, an evaluation of performance, not proof.
So if the verdict hinges on a juror misunderstanding DNA probability or not getting why someone might falsely confess or trusting a flawed eyewitness ID, then the whole verdict is built on sand.
Exactly. It takes the focus away from blaming individual bad jurors and puts it right back on the systemic design.
Really?
Is it sensible to rely on untrained laypeople for such complex, high-stakes decisions?
And this reliance on subjective judgment, on performance, on gut feelings, this is where Lake argues systemic bias gets baked right into the outcomes.
Yes. This isn't just random noise, he says. The errors aren't equally distributed. He states very clearly, bias becomes operationalized into verdicts.
And this is where the statistical evidence becomes absolutely crucial and frankly damning. He uses that specific data point from the National Registry of Exonerations.
The one about race.
Yes, that Black Americans are more than twice as likely to be wrongfully convicted of serious crimes like murder than white Americans.
That single statistic is devastating if you believe the system is supposed to be fair or objective. Lake argues, how is that possible? If the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt were applied equally and rigorously, without bias, you simply could not get that kind of massive racial disparity in wrongful conviction rates.
So the disparity itself is proof.
It's powerful evidence, he contends, that bias, whether it's conscious prejudice or unconscious stereotypes or institutional factors that disadvantage minority defendants, is actively influencing the trial process and leading directly to discriminatory outcomes, different results for different people.
And if the system can't deliver justice equally, regardless of race, then Lake's core conclusion seems almost unavoidable. The whole foundation is compromised. It's fraudulent, in his view. It delivers justice selectively.
And disproportionately harms certain groups. He argues this bias creeps in everywhere. Maybe in who the police initially suspect, how vigorously a case is prosecuted, the quality of defense counsel available in the different communities, and yes, in those subjective judgments jurors make about credibility and demeanor in the courtroom.
And throughout this, Lake never lets us forget the human cost. He keeps bringing it back to that.
Relentlessly. He doesn't talk about abstract legal errors. He talks about innocent people being put in a cage and called it justice. He talks about lives shattered. He forces the reader and us to confront the real-world consequences of these structural choices, these systemic flaws, these operationalized biases. He refuses to let the system hide behind the facade of due process when the result is predictable, unequal, and devastating for the innocent. And again, the subtext is clear. Don't you dare minimize this.
So the trial itself is flawed, the standards are weak, bias creeps in, but what about the safety net? Surely the appeals process is there to catch these terrible mistakes. Lake's answer seems to be a resounding no.
Emphatically no. His logic is brutally simple here. If appeals worked, the exoneration list wouldn't exist. The very fact that we have a growing list of people proven innocent after conviction is proof the appeals process failed them.
Failed them for years, often decades.
Exactly. The fact that innocent people, as he puts it, rot for decades before the truth gets airtime demonstrates that the appellate system isn't primarily focused on finding innocence. Its main goal, Lake concludes, is protecting the verdict, not the defendant.
That's a really important distinction for listeners to grasp, I think. Appellate courts aren't usually retrying the facts. They're mostly looking for specific legal errors made during the original trial, and they give huge deference to the jury's original findings.
Right. It's about procedural correctness, legal precedent, and ensuring the finality of judgments. Is the paperwork in order? Was the
Yeah.
law applied correctly, more or less? It's generally not a second chance for the defendant to argue, hey, they just got the facts wrong, I didn't do it.
Which means, practically, that unless there's some very specific, recognized legal error, the guilty verdict stands, even if the person is actually innocent.
And that's why innocent people stay locked up, often for decades. Until something extraordinary happens outside the normal appeals process, like the Innocence Project getting involved with new DNA testing, or maybe an investigative journalist uncovering hidden evidence, or the real perpetrator confessing. These are often external interventions, not the system self-correcting through its own appellate procedures.
And Lake sees that delay, that inertia, as a direct consequence of a system prioritizing its own stability and the finality of its verdicts over the freedom of potentially innocent individuals.
The system values predictability and closure over revisiting uncomfortable truths.
And this massive failure, this multi-layered failure trial and appeal demands accountability in Lake's view. He completely rejects the usual responses, what he calls the bureaucracy, deflection, and procedural hand-waving.
Yeah, he has no patience for the official statement saying, we regret the error, processes are being reviewed. He sees that as dodging responsibility for the catastrophic harm caused.
His demand is much more direct.
Much more. He essentially challenges the system. Don't minimize it. Don't pass the blame onto the government as some abstract entity. He says the harm is real. He sees any attempt to frame these wrongful convictions as mere mistakes or unavoidable accidents as part of the problem itself, a way to avoid confronting the foundational flaws. It's another form of minimization he won't accept.
And this leads to perhaps his most inflammatory claim, where the language just escalates incredibly. He makes this specific, really provocative accusation about malice.
Right, the malice claim. What exactly does he say there?
He claims there is, quote, black and white proof the jury used malice. Otherwise, why did the defendant get exonerated?
Wow, malice. That implies, like, conscious evil intent, doesn't it? Is he really saying jurors deliberately convicted someone they knew was innocent? Or is he using malice in a different way?
It feels like he's using it more as a proxy for extreme recklessness, or a complete, willful disregard for the legal standard they swore to uphold. His argument seems to be, the evidence of innocence, or at least reasonable doubt, was there, proven by the later exoneration. For the jury to ignore that evidence and convict anyway demonstrates a level of negligence so profound, so damaging in its consequences, decades of stolen life, that it borders on malicious disregard for the defendant's rights and the law itself.
So less about evil thoughts, more about the outcome being so foreseeably catastrophic from ignoring the standard that it functions like malice. A failure so extreme it demands that level of condemnation.
I think that's the most plausible reading. It's a rhetorical strategy, perhaps, designed to shock the system into recognizing the severity of the failure. He's saying, by maintaining this flawed system, by protecting these flawed verdicts, the system isn't just making mistakes, it's choosing to create victims. And that choice, that conscious maintenance of a broken machine, feels malicious in its effect, even if not an individual juror intent.
It definitely maximizes the demand for accountability. You can't just say oops to malice.
Exactly. And that level of failure, that perceived malice or gross negligence, requires a response far beyond just, tweaking a procedure or issuing a quiet report. Lake demands a real public reckoning, an apology.
And not just a general apology from the system.
No. He's very specific, not just to the court, not to the system, but directly to the families whose lives you destroyed. He brings it back to the human cost again. And he concludes with this incredibly powerful image. Every single wrongful conviction, every exoneration stands as a monument to your failure.
A monument.
Yeah.
Not a glitch, not an error, but a lasting, visible structure built by the system itself, commemorating its own catastrophic failure and the destruction it caused. That's an image that really stays with you. Hashtag, tag, outro.
So when you pull all of Lake's arguments together, it's clear this isn't just picking at details. It's a fundamental structural takedown. He says, beyond a reasonable doubt is functionally broken, a slogan undermined by ambiguity and subjectivity.
Right. Then the adversarial system itself guarantees failure because it's designed to reward winning, not truth-finding, with prosecutors incentivized for convictions and defense structurally under-resourced.
Then there's the practical problem. Lay jurors are just not equipped to handle the complex scientific and psychological evidence in modern trials, leading them to rely on unreliable cues like credibility or performance.
And layered on top of all that, systemic bias gets baked into the process, leading to demonstrably unequal outcomes, particularly based on race. It's not random, it's operationalized.
And crucially, Lake insists this failure is structural. It's not about a few bad apples or unlucky mistakes. It's inherent in the design. His paper really forces you to question what due process even means if it systematically, predictably produces innocent victims.
And then uses its own procedures, like the appeals process, primarily to protect the flawed verdict that victimized them in the first place. He challenges the very legitimacy of the process as currently practiced.
The real power of this paper, I think, is that refusal to let anyone off the hook by minimizing the harm. By saying, oh, it's regrettable but rare. Lake demands we confront the reality. Stealing decades of someone's life is a catastrophic failure, period. It requires a full accounting for those lost years, the broken families, the clear institutional negligence.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with that final, really provocative question that Lake implicitly poses. His paper basically asserts that given all these stacked failures, the bad incentives, the cognitive biases, the structural flaws, the justice system needs almost superhuman luck to get it right in the first place.
Superhuman luck, that's a chilling thought.
It is, and if that assertion holds even a kernel of truth, then what is the deep moral obligation of a society that knowingly chooses to maintain such a system? A system that, according to Lake, systematically steals decades of freedom from innocent people, fully aware of the structural flaws that guarantee it will keep happening.
That is definitely something to grapple with long after this deep dive ends. Thank you for joining us today as we navigated this really challenging but absolutely crucial text from Justin Lake.